We are going to start with the history of the museums. And it's not only the museum as an institution, but the role of a curator within it. And as a curator, we have to also understand that we are dependent upon other individuals in the museum. That you cannot do any exhibitions without kissing the ring of the conservator. Dang near literally, depending on who the conservator is. Because the conservator has the last say over what leaves the collection and goes on public display. So when we're looking at being curators, we understand it in a very real way is a team approach. But it didn't used to be that way. So we're going to go way back to the beginnings of the first museums. And we can, in a very real way, in the same way that that pencil is a visual representation of an idea or an event, that museums and their collections were visual narratives. They were stories, because these objects, as they were collected by early leaders, early rulers, they didn't collect things at random. They were done with an express intent. So early on, and this has been throughout pretty much of human history, particularly in the West, that antiquities, even in the days of antiquity, such as if you're the Persian ruler Darius, this guy wanted antiquities, things that were old, because they were some way to prove your right to rule. So they were valued for not only historical, but also political and spiritual significance. And they were, in a real way, these objects were narratives. They were stories of the success of your nation, of your rulership, or you as an individual. And very often the objects were a result of tribute. Tribute is the things that people bring to you in order for you not to beat them up anymore. All right, you've conquered people and you make them give you stuff. Empires do this. The Maya did it. The Aztec did it. You made people give you things once you conquered them. All right, so it was evidence of conquest, but also of your wealth. It was also seen as being part of being cultured, of high social, cultural standing, as compared to possessing culture as we would see it today. Anyway, when you're collecting all this stuff, you got to have a place to store it. And that gives rise to some of the first museums. However, the prototype for museums actually aren't necessarily for objects. So early collections, whether they be in Egypt or Mesopotamia or Babylon or Persia. Now Persia, I prefer to use that word as compared to Iran and Iraq. Those are political terms that were part of dividing up the world after World War I and World War II. People from Iran still call themselves Persians. They don't call themselves Arabs. Or whether it be from medieval or Renaissance Europe, these were objects that were amassed by your elite, wealthy, powerful people since the beginnings of empires. They were generally private, whereas today, museums are supposed to be public institutions. And this time long ago, you didn't want the public. You didn't want the riffraff running through your storage areas. All right? That you might allow certain individuals to see them as evidences of your power. Or you may even roll something out now and then to remind people of how powerful you are. But they weren't for public access. They definitely were not for education. And so the objects, because we've got this large holding, they were inventoried. So the rulers knew what was in the collections, but they weren't studied or exhibited to the public. So the earlier word, museum, it's Greek etymology. Etymology means the history or foundations of a word. It translates into seat of the muses. So a muse is contemplation. That's thinking. And the library at Alexandria, which was started in the 3rd century BC, is considered probably the first place that we would see as a large holding that was made available for people to come and study, as compared to earlier collections where no one could get access to them. This one was more publicly open. However, you still had to be a certain social standing. You definitely could not get into the library if you were a woman. Women weren't intelligent. They could be goddesses, but if you look at Greek mythology, women are often that classical, that's that perception of being really fickle. Right? Women weren't considered full human beings in this day. And this library became the prototype for universities because of the components that were held within it. Now, it was planned and it actually opened during the reign of Ptolemy I. His son also continued this. Now, it was originally, you might say, curated or planned by a student whose name was Demetrius. And he was a student of Aristotle, the famous philosopher. Aristotle is the very same philosopher who would be, his thinking would be the foundation for some debates that would occur in Spain after the Americas were encountered by Spain. And they were deciding whether or not Indians were human beings. And the lawyer, whose name was Juan Gines de Sepulveda, was arguing under Aristotle's laws that Indians weren't human. They were natural slaves. They were beasts of burden. This was a debate going on in the university. And there was a former conquistador whose name was Bartolome de las Casas, was saying, no, wait a second, they are humans. We can Christianize them. Therefore, they're human. So the basis of whether Indians were human or not was whether they could be Christianized or not. That's the same philosopher, though. So he may have been learned, but I wouldn't argue that he was humanitarian. It was the largest, most important library of the ancient world. It was a major, major center of scholarship from the 3rd century until the Roman conquest of Egypt. And this is a very controversial set of events. But here's a rendering of how that library would have looked. And you'll note that it's mostly scrolls, right? Because bookbinding really hadn't come to be. There was no printing press yet. So everything was copied longhand and then rolled up into scrolls. And so that's what you were looking at in most of these library collections. And you'll note there are no women. And this may look like a woman's attire, but it's a toga. So it had a layout much like a college campus, where there was a walkway. So if you walk out into the dance circle there, there's walkways that go around the whole thing. And here they're oriented to the solstice and the equinox, that walkway and the buildings. All right, there were also gardens. We have our own garden now. All right, there was a room for shared dining. A reading room, lecture halls, meeting rooms. Does that look kind of familiar? So this library influenced your later on university campus layouts. And it had an acquisitions department because part of a library's responsibility is to go out and collect writings. In this case, it was scrolls. In modern day, it's books, as well as cataloging. So they had to have an inventory because when scholars came, they had to have a way to be able to find whatever scroll or writings they were looking for. So there were shelves for the collections of scrolls, and they were on papyrus, which is a reed. And it was called bibliothecae. And it may have had a stone inscription above the lintel on the door that said, "The place of the cure of the soul." However, Plutarch, the historian, wrote that when Julius Caesar was visiting Alexandria, he accidentally burned the library down. So the place burns to the ground. It is one of the largest losses of human knowledge of the ancient world. This was considered one of the wonders, the 7 wonders of the ancient world. An equivalent thing would happen here, but it was done intentionally in Mexico and in Guatemala. When Friar Diego de Landa ordered the burning of the Aztec and Maya codices. The Aztec and the Maya had astounding knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, medicine, literature, agriculture. But it wasn't only elite rulers, because once an emperor whose name was Constantine, and there was various debates over what happened with Constantine. Constantine was a Roman emperor who converted to Christianity. So he became a Christ-bearing conqueror at the time that Rome was looking into barbarian Europe, where people out in France, the Gauls, and England were painting their bellies blue and barking at the moon. At this very same time period, a city that is no longer inhabited in the sense of being a large population called Teotihuacan was emerging. At the time, London, Madrid, and Paris were cow pastures. These cities had 100,000 people plus, were centers of trade and knowledge.